One of my favorite quotes is something I care a lot about, which is about process, is by Nate Fortin. It says, "A fractured process makes for a fractured user experience." I feel that even if you're not a user experience designer, maybe you're a developer or a copywriter or even a project manager, we're all working towards a user experience. And if your process is fractured, then it's likely your UX is going to be fractured as well. And so I think the old way a lot of people used to think about the web was to create pages, and that's definitely an outdated way to think about things. It's all about creating systems. There's another quote by Paul Sappho that says, "It used to be that designers made an object and walked away. Today, the emphasis must shift to designing the entire life cycle." I think this is pretty important. It's not just about the visual final product. It's, all the steps along the way as well. This is kind of why I'm really into Sass and some of the things I'm about to talk about today. So, who is using CSS preprocessors right now? Almost all of you. That's cool. Okay. Who's not? So, just a few of you. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly tell you about why they're awesome and why you should be using them. The whole idea behind them is you have a language that you write, and it gets compiled to CSS. The whole reason that these exist is to help you do dry development. And the idea behind dry development is you don't repeat yourself. Standard CSS, you tend to have a lot of repetition. And so CSS preprocessing helps you avoid that. It also helps enable smarter patterns and proportions, especially with a lot of the operators and things that Sass gives you, which I'll go into a little bit later. And it also makes things easier to maintain. That's really important to me. I want not only my CSS to be maintainable, but I want my UX to be maintainable, so I feel that Sass kind of helps enable that a little easier. So the three more common, I guess, CSS preprocessors, Sass, Less, and Stylus. The one I'm most familiar with and the one I use is Sass, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. A lot of the concepts and ideas translate over to Less and Stylus, with a couple exceptions here or there, which I'll point out. But for the most part, if you're using Less or if you're using Stylus, the ideas are the same. So this is the Sass website. It's not so pretty. But it's got a lot of information on there for you, but it's kind of hard to digest. And so I'll kind of walk you through some of the basics. There's also a library called Compass that you can optionally use on top of Sass, which gives you a lot of extra good stuff. So if you're already using Sass but you're not using Compass, I highly recommend you use Compass. So I am curious, of those that are using Sass, who's using the original syntax, the white space indented syntax? Just a few of you. And who's using the SCSS syntax, which is the newer one? Okay. Some of you that might be thinking about using Sass might be wondering which one is the right one for you. So if you like your code to look like CSS, but you just want to add on the extra features, then you definitely want to be writing SCSS. This is one I personally prefer in my personal projects. Any CSS file will validate as an SCSS file. It's basically like an extension of CSS. However, and here's what that kind of looks like. You got your curly braces, you got your semicolons, but you get the extra stuff like mixins and things, which I'll go a little more into later. However, if you prefer writing very terse, minimal code, and you don't want to write curly braces, you don't want to write semicolons, and you like the Python style indented syntax, then Sass is the syntax for you. And this is actually what we use at work. So I kind of live in both lands. And so this is that same mixin, but a lot smaller. And instead of writing out mixin, you get these character shortcuts, the equal sign and the plus. Most of my slides are going to be in SCSS unless I'm showing stuff from work, in which case there will be an SASS. So hopefully that doesn't confuse anyone. This is just something I like to throw in because I see it a lot on Twitter. It's Sass with the lowercase ASS. It's not all caps. So just in case you want to feel really smart about talking about Sass, now you know. There's a lot of common misconceptions about CSS preprocessors and Sass, and I just want to kind of show how those are wrong. Some people think like, oh, well, I don't want to use the command line. Well, you don't have to. I'm from a design background. I'm trying to avoid the command line at all costs, but I do have to use it occasionally. But for Sass, like just to get it up and running, I use an app to do it. And so it's not necessary. But it is there in case you do like the command line. Some people feel like they don't want to learn Ruby. You don't have to learn Ruby. It does use Ruby right now. They are working on, a new version that is, I think it's in C, and it's going to let it be translated to Python and all these other different languages. Right now it is a Ruby thing, but you don't have to know Ruby to use it. So this is one of the popular apps in case you want to use an app. It's called Live Reload. It works with CoffeeScript, it works with Less, it works with all sorts of different stuff. It also makes sure if you're coding, every time you save, your browser will automatically reload, so you don't have to kind of pop back and forth and refresh. It's pretty cool. Another one, which is more popular with design people, because it's really pretty, is CodeKit, and it does pretty much the same thing. It has some other extra stuff, like it'll actually compress images, and it just kind of is a nicer way to visualize it. There's also Compass app, which I think Farouk uses. He was in here a second ago. It's kind of like the official Compass app. It just works with Sass. It doesn't work with Less and everything else. So there's definitely that one if you want to use the official thing. And there's also Scout, which I used to use before I started using Live Reload. This one was pretty awesome when I was kind of getting started out because, again, I don't really work well with the command line, so it's nice to kind of just launch this up. You tell it where your files are, and it just does all the watching and everything for you. There's actually a log tab, which gives you pretty much the same output that you would see in terminal of like any errors and things. So I still get that stuff too. Because it's an error app, it's not just for the Mac. There's also some of these responses I actually got from when I did a survey about Sass and CSS preprocessors. So these are actually real things people said. And one of the things that I thought was kind of funny is like, well, I want my CSS that's on my website to be really formatted pretty and indented and with lots of pretty comments and ASCII characters and everything. And the thing is, you should be compressing your CSS anyway, so that's kind of not really a valid argument. So I just kind of tell people that's a silly argument to have. There's also the idea of like having to learn a whole new thing. That's not necessarily the case. If you are using SCSS or Less, it's the same exact syntax. You're just adding on new things. But it's not like an entire new thing. And then for the Sass syntax and stylus, yeah, it's a little different, but it's not really that much different. It's pretty easy to learn. So this one I thought was funny. It was like, well, the person I hire might not know it, so don't hire that person. And the way I feel is like, if you have like a skill set that you require your people to have, why would you hire someone that doesn't have that skill set? I feel like this is an important skill to have, especially because a lot of the features in CSS preprocessing are being put into CSS. So I just think it's a silly way to think about it. This one I thought was really funny. It's like, well, isn't importing files in CSS bad? And I think it's just a kind of a funny thing. Like, yeah, if you're doing it in straight up CSS, you are pulling in multiple files, and those are each calls to the server. But with Sass, it's actually all getting compiled into one final CSS file. So no, it's not. So yeah, just to show, like, with normal CSS, you have the main CSS file, and then the two you're importing, that's 3 files, but with Sass, this is all just 1 file. So Sass Benefits. So this was actually one of the first things I started trying out when I first got into Sass, and it was just like nesting. I don't like writing things over and over again, and so if you look on the right, like if you type an unordered list with a class of items, and you have an anchor, and then you're styling different types of that anchor, you tend to write that selector out over and over and over again. The nesting is really awesome because you just write it once. There's also the idea of a parent selector, which is the ampersand. And the great thing about that is it just tacks on to whatever's the most immediate parent. And you can also nest the parent selector inside of things. So in this case, if you're using like HTML5 boilerplate, you know how it does those like IE classes that you can use to style things to override. You can keep everything together by just writing .ie-6 ampersand, and what it spits out is everything inside the .ie6. This is also helpful if you're using Modernizer. You know how it's got all those like classes it generates that you can use to style things. You can keep everything together, which is really nice. You can also nest media queries. So that can be pretty helpful if maybe you're just overriding one thing. Rather than tacking it all at the end or having this whole separate file, maybe it makes more sense to keep it all together. So it's cool that you get to nest that, and it'll reverse it for you in the output. I guess, less known thing that you can do is you can nest properties. And so if you're writing a style for your borders, and then maybe you're changing the color of the top and turning off the left border, you don't have to write border over and over again. You can just write border once, and then whatever comes after the hyphen can just be nested inside. So that's not like a super useful thing, but it can be helpful at times. So variables are what really, really made me embrace Sass. At first, I was reluctant to use it. I was one of those designers that was like, oh, I handwrite my CSS. I don't need a CSS preprocessor. And then I started using variables, and I realized I was really, really wrong about that. It's really awesome that I can just have one spot where my colors and maybe my type is like set at certain sizes, and I want to use consistent sizing everywhere. Variables give you that. And then mixins and extend are things I kind of took on after that. The thing I really love about mixins is you can pass things through them, like arguments through them. So maybe you have like a consistent padding for your boxes, and so you just make this mixin, so you make it really easy to get the proper spacing. But then for a certain box, you want to override that. This might not be a really good example of that, but if you imagine like more detailed mixins that you might be writing, maybe you want to take on all the same things, but like 1 or 2 things are different, you can pass that through with the parentheses and override it. So that's particularly helpful if you're using it for like border radiuses or box shadows and things like that. So the problem with mixins, however, is that block of code gets printed over and over again. And that's actually one of the big problems I have with less, and why I prefer Sass, is every time you call upon a mixin, that's being printed in your CSS again. So the idea of extend was born from that problem. So what Sass does is lets you extend on a selector. So in this case, like maybe you have a div called message, and it's like this nice fancy message styling. And then maybe you have another one that's called error, and it looks almost like message, but maybe the background color is different, or maybe it has a different icon. The older way we would probably do that is we might write in our HTML message space error, so we have 2 classes. So the idea of extend is to find a way to not have to use 2 classes. You can just use the one. And so you can have alert extend upon message. And what that will do is instead of printing those styles again, it'll tack it on with a comma, so it shares those styles. the other thing to keep in mind is like every time you call upon message, and it's going to tack it onto there. So if you have a .message.alert, now you're going to have a .error.alert. But this is really helpful in keeping your CSS a lot cleaner. However, the problem with that is like sometimes people are making these placeholder classes just to be extended upon. So like maybe you have a class of clearfix. You don't actually ever use clearfix in your HTML, but you have it in your Sass so that you can extend upon it every time you need it. But now that class of clearfix is being output in your CSS. So the idea of placeholder selectors just recently came out in the new Sass version, and these are really, really awesome. So instead of a class, these are like silent classes. And so instead of a dot, you would use a percentage sign. So this is really awesome for grid systems. Maybe you're using the popular 960 grid system, and right now your CSS would output grid 1, grid 2, grid 3, grid 4. Maybe you're not using all of those. If you make them into silent classes, they're only going to be extended upon. They're never going to show up in your output. And all the placeholder selectors you might have widths for that aren't being used, those won't ever get output either because they're not being used yet. So this is like a huge, huge win for Sass. If you're not using Sass, you should be using Sass. This one I really like, especially for design. I like to design in the browser. I've hardly pull up Photoshop these days anymore and just do everything in CSS because CSS has become really powerful these days. And one of the things I used to get frustrated with is maybe I need a darker version of a blue that I'm using, or maybe I need to just kind of saturate it a little more. I'd always have to load up Photoshop just to do that thing. But with Sass, I can let it do that for me. So it's kind of awesome. And this is just a small list of what is available. There's a huge amount of things you can do to your colors, just mixing them, adjusting them, spinning, like, or saturating them. There's so much you can do. There was this cool tool that just came out recently that's pretty rad if you're just designing in the browser and don't want to pull up Photoshop, called SassMe, and it lets you visualize that. So you put in your input color and kind of tell it, like, I want it to be 10% darker, or I want to saturate it more, and it'll show you what that color is going to be. So pretty helpful. That's, I don't know if you can see the URL, but you know, I'll tell you where the slides are later. So this is a simple one, but worth mentioning, the commenting options. If you write a multi-line comment, that's going to get output in your CSS, unless, of course, you're compressing it. And then if you, what Sass gives you is the idea of, oh, that's really hard to see. I'm sorry, guys. Like I said, the slide, I will tell you where you can get the slides later so you can look at this. I'm sorry? Yeah, if I was live coding, I would do it right now, but I'm sorry about that. But Sass gives you our single line comments, and these are always hidden from your output. So it's kind of nice if you're developing and you don't want certain comments to appear in your output. Even in dev mode, you can just use a single line comment. One thing I forgot to put here is there is a way, like maybe you're compressing your CSS, but you want your comments to be in the output regardless, like maybe it's a copyright statement. You can actually override the comment compression by using a multi-line comment, and after the asterisk, add an exclamation mark, and that'll force that comment to output in your CSS. So if you care about copyright statements and stuff, there you go. So operations are pretty rad because I typically do this a lot with like generating grid systems or generating font sizes. I like to have a base font size, and rather than doing the math to figure out like a rhythm for the other font sizing I want, I can use Sass to figure that out for me. this is particularly helpful if you're using REM sizing instead of relative sizing. You can kind of write like this mixin that does like the operations for you. And so you only write, maybe it's a base of 16 pixels, but you don't want to write 1.6 rem. Like you can have it do the operations for you. So functions are awesome. They're, gosh. Yeah. Sorry about the darkness. Anyway, functions are really awesome because you can do a lot of really powerful stuff. For example, let's say you have a bunch of images that are prefixed with the same name in the file name, and you don't want to write out like what all those images are. You can use @each and then write those out. So in this case, I wrote one for red and for blue, and then you write the rule for it and where those would get passed through. So in your output, it writes all that out for you, and you don't have to write that over and over and over again. There's also conditionals. So, you know, your standard if, else, or if, else, and else. So if you're writing really complex functions, this is really handy because you can, you know, conditionally style things differently based on what context you're in. Whoops, went too fast. Yeah, the other cool thing I really like about Sass is it's hard to mess up because it gives you a pretty verbose like error and tells you what line it comes from, and this is really handy. I also wanted to mention that if you're using the development mode of compilation, you'll actually get really detailed line numbers and which file things come from. So a lot of people get concerned about like, well, if these are all getting compiled into one final CSS, how do I debug that? Just turn on development mode, and it'll tell you exactly like where that rule came from, which line number, which file. And I think there's actually some tools that can put it, like if you're using Firebug, I think there's one called FireSass that will actually put it in your debugger. So yeah. So I think style guides are really awesome. Who's working on a style guide with the app that they're working on? Just a few of you. So style guides and CSS preprocessors combined, I think, are really, really super rad and really help your workflow. A long time ago, I wrote an article about style guides for interfaces called Writing an Interface Style Guide. Back then, I was kind of thinking of it more in terms of just like branding and writing styles and some development standards and things. But they still weren't truly like living style guides. And the whole point of having documentation is that it needs to be current and useful. If it's not current and useful, then it just shouldn't even exist. It's silly. It's got to be current and useful. So when I first started working at Engine Yard a while back, I documented what my process was of A, learning Sass for the first time, but B, also trying to refactor everything and document everything. So if you're curious about what that process was like for me, feel free to read the article on it. Since then, my process has changed a lot, but it's kind of fun to go back and read. But some of the things I point out that like I find is for people that maybe are just getting started out with this is to start small, because if you try to take on too much, then you get overwhelmed. And I don't know how many times I've worked with companies where we start like this giant refactor and it never really gets done because we just try to do it all in one go. And we end up now having like old stuff and new stuff, and it never really works out. So I decided to just iterate slowly on this refactor. And so I started with the variables and then the mixins, and then like started getting into the more advanced stuff. I also should note that it's a good idea to sketch out like the architecture that you want to do for Sass. I know people do it for other things, but I think it's good to do it for Sass too, because then it's easy to just jump right in and then realize you maybe didn't go the right path that you should have taken. So I highly recommend that. And it's super important to stay organized. really, really important. It's easy to think like I'll just throw this here for now and I'll get back to it later. No, you won't. Stay organized. And I want to really, really stress how important it is to have clarity in your naming things. A lot of people like to be really brief and like to abbreviate things, but clarity is incredibly important. And so when I was doing this refactor at Engine Yard, we decided that we would have verbose naming. Like instead of abbreviating things, we would just write it out, because then everybody knows what it is. Everyone, can, whether you're a designer, developer, whoever you are, could see and know what it is. Just a side note, I think file organization is also important as part of the workflow. It's not really a Sass thing, it's just a general workflow thing. I like to keep vendor stuff separate from my stuff. I also like to keep my layout images that are being brought in through CSS separate from my content images that are embedded in the page. So I think that's a helpful thing to mention. But again, stay organized. One of the things I learned when I first started writing Sass is that nesting can really get you in trouble. It's really cool, but it also can mess you up. And so my general rule is try not to nest more than 3 deep. If you're nesting more than 3 deep, you're probably doing something wrong. I think a lot of people that try out Sass, like they love that it's like this whole indented thing and they can read where everything is, and so they kind of write it like the document model. But when you do that, it's creating all those really long selectors, and not only is your CSS actually going to end up larger than it should be, it's also too specific, and things aren't as modular and reusable as they should be. So like not only do you want your code to be where you aren't repeating yourselves, but you want your UI elements to be reusable and not have to create them over and over again. So keep things as less specific as possible. It makes your CSS more usable, more maintainable, and cleaner. So this was an early version of the style guide I was working on when I was at Engine Yard and started kind of documenting like what all the different UI elements were. And I found out that this was way better than documenting on like a wiki or documenting on a PDF file. I actually put the style guide on the app itself as a page inside the app. And so all the UI elements are rendering from the exact same code that you're documenting. And so if it's broken here, then you know it's broken in your app. And so it's kind of awesome to do this because it becomes like a sandbox in a way where you can start building little UI elements and see them working in the code they should be working in while you're documenting. But it also acts as a form of QA in a way where you can make sure that all your elements are looking right. The other awesome thing, keeping in mind the whole like keep it current and useful, like if you're changing colors every now and then, updating your color palette can be really annoying. But if you're using variables for your colors and your color palette is being generated from those variables, you never have to update this. So if you change your link color, your documentation is already updated. Like, that's really cool. There's been a lot of tools that have come out since that when I was doing that, which I wish I would have had back then, but they're actually generators. So this one I like is called StyleDoc, and basically it runs on Node.js, and all it does is it looks at your CSS, and it can look at Sass and less as well, and it creates the documentation for you just based on markdown comments. There's a few other ones out there, but I felt like this was the most automated one. And so this is an example of it with Twitter Bootstrap. It basically sees the Twitter Bootstrap styles, it outputs them on the right, and then on the left, it actually will show you, it uses the comments to create like what the different headings are, and then it shows you like the UI element in place. So if you don't want to go through the trouble of making all of that for like all those pages of the style guide, I definitely recommend trying out StyleDoc. Again, that's like my favorite one out of all the ones that are out there. So recently I was working on the redesign of our website at Do, and I thought it might be fun to just kind of show you some stuff I did. I don't know yet if this was the best way to do it, but I at least like to talk about it, because then I can get feedback from other people, and maybe it will also inspire people too. I don't know. So the big thing we wanted to do was have a foundation of code that works for a marketing site, but also works for our web app. But they each could kind of have their own feel or their own brand. And so, and we also wanted it to be responsive. So I just wanted to mention, like, iframes. I know that's like a bad word now, iframes, but it's actually pretty helpful if you're just trying to get a general sense of how your page is looking in different sizes. It's not an accurate sense for mobile devices, but it at least gives you an idea. So that was pretty helpful. Like, you know, again, like I said, I like to design in the browser, so it was really helpful to do that against these different wireframes. So the way I set it up is, I'm just going to have to talk you through it because the code is really hard to see. I start out with my vendor framework. So this is like Compass, and there are some additional Compass imports we use. There's some other tools out there like Suzy, which are like grid frameworks on top of Compass. So this is where I would put that if I were using that. These are like other people's code that we're using. And then I start with my reset, and I don't like those crazy resets that print out like this huge list of selectors in one huge go, because it makes debugging a pain in the butt, but it also stomps on too much that it doesn't really necessarily need to be stomping on. And so personally, I just use two things. I use Paul Irish's recommendation to use border box on all elements. It makes your styling a lot easier. It's actually a better border box model to work with, and he's got some talk in his article about it, about, you know, he tested like about any speed problems, and there wasn't really any speed problems with it, so I use it. If Paul Irish says to use it, I'm going to use it. So I'm using the Compass mixin here. So typically with box sizing, you'd have to write this out for all the different vendor prefixes. So if you use Compass, you can actually just include that mixin for it, and it'll write out all the different vendor prefixes for you. So another reason why you should use Compass. It makes it easier. And then I just use the normalize, which you can find in HTML5 boilerplate. You can find it in Bootstrap. Like, basically everybody's moving towards this particular reset, because it doesn't do too much. It just does what you need it to do. So I recommend normalize. Then I start with dependencies. And these are your variables, your mixins, basically creating a library of settings and tools that you can use throughout your CSS. But if you were to compile these on their own, they won't actually emit any CSS. They only do so once you use them. That way, it just becomes like this global tool set that we can use throughout all our different applications. Oh, and that would be things like your color settings and type settings and things like that. Next, I bring in foundation, and the way I like to look at it is, like in microformats, they have that acronym POSH, which means plain old semantic HTML. This is basically what I'm focusing on at this point, is just styling the content, not thinking about any components or classes or IDs or anything extra, just straight up content. The cool thing about this is if you're doing responsive design, it's like you're kind of designing something for very small devices right at the get-go, and then you know, you can add on from there. So yeah, just paragraphs, headings, basic stuff. So I have these, like, this file that's like a grid file of like all the different sizing I need, but again, at this point I'm using placeholder selectors, so it's pretty, it's not gonna spit out like a bunch of stuff that I don't need. I also, for helpers, I bring in things like the clear fix, all the different just tools that you might be using throughout your styling. Another really cool thing that Sass 3.2, the new Sass introduced, is so before you couldn't pass variables into media queries, and now you can. So this is awesome because you can set up your different breakpoints. Like maybe you have one for iPhone, one for tablet, one for, whatever your different sizes are. You can set those up at the beginning and then create a mixin where you can pass those breakpoints through it and then create a conditional. And there's this awesome thing that the new Sass came out with called @content. And basically it's sort of like a backwards mixin in a way, where it's like you can pass content into that mixin. So in this case, if I were to write code for iPhone, it would get passed into that media query. It's basically like the content idea in like Rails, if you've used Rails. The way I kind of played around with this, one thing to note with extend in Sass is you have to extend within the same identical media query. So if you are trying to extend into a mobile media query, it won't work properly. And they did that on purpose because it could be confusing, like for Sass to know like where to put these rules, and it might break specificity and the way it loads or cascades. So they purposefully made it to where you can only extend into the same identical media query. So for this, I created, I used a mixin where I could target iPhone or target tablet or whatever. And then when I made my placeholder selectors, I made them a little bit more specific. So like, I don't like to write the grid over and over and over again if I don't need to. So if you, excuse me, if you are just like styling something on the small device and on a larger device, it doesn't need to be rewritten again, then why rewrite it again? And so I like to keep my placeholder selectors specific to the media queries that they need to go in so that I can just cascade upwards. I'm really into the start small and add on larger. It's like the whole 320 and up concept, rather than writing for large displays and overwriting for small, because that way smaller devices just get what they need. So this is a common thing you'll see in like Bootstrap or a lot of other frameworks that are out there, but I now start thinking about my components. So these are things like my buttons, certain forms, little reusable things that can be dropped anywhere in the site and it'll just work. There's one I wanted to kind of tell you about that I think is really cool. We made one called PopStripe. So on the top of our website, we have this rainbow stripe. And this crazy, awesome function creates that rainbow stripe. So basically, what I wanted to do was use CSS gradients to create the stripe across the top instead of an image, because we get fickle. We change the colors sometimes and decide like we don't like that green anymore, so we might change it. And it's just a pain in the butt to change that image over and over again for each time. So if we use a gradient and basically put the starts and stops of each color right next to each other, it basically creates a stripe. So I created this mixin for it, but it was very verbose in that it was tied to 8 colors. It had to be 8 colors. And it was always horizontal. And there was a lot of repetition in just like setting up like, okay, now do this color, now do this color. So basically I dropped it into a gist on GitHub and tweeted like, hey, does anybody know how this can be better? And I got this awesome response from Eric A. Meyer, not the Meyer Web Eric Meyer, but the Eric Meyer that did Suzy, the framework. He gave me this, and I just wanted to share it with you. You'll have to look at the slides later to get it. But basically, he made it to where you can have as many colors as you want. It doesn't matter. You can have whichever direction you wanted. and it's just like a lot cleaner. And all you have to do to use it is just include this little mix-in and pop in your colors. So I just thought that was really awesome, and really, in my opinion, a really fantastic example of why Sass is like really powerful and awesome. Because that would have been a lot, like what this generates is a string of CSS gradients, and you know how annoying it is to write CSS gradients with all the different prefixes. WebKit has 2 different ones. It's just really hard to do, and this basically will do that for all of those colors. And so what that created was this little PopStripe, and it's flexible, so if you resize the browser, the stripes change size. And all just like with that code, like it's super flexible, and like anyone can use a stripes, have stripes on their site now with any colors they want. So pretty awesome. I just wanted to share that. So after that, I like to do my themes. So I realized after a certain time that font colors typically are going to be paired with background colors. And rather than writing those over and over again, I create these themes that I can use. So if I need a light theme or a dark theme, at work we have one called Orangina, which is like this really orangey, poppy one. It's nice to have those as reusable themes that you can use throughout your CSS. I recommend doing that. And then I think about my regions, which are like my header, sidebar, footer. These are like location-based things. They're not like componentized things, so I keep those separate. I bring in my print styles. I just use the HTML5 boilerplate print styles because I just think they've already done a lot of good work in there. And then this I just wanted to show is like an interesting thing we're trying out. So I have this section called Tools, which is where I'm going to be putting like CSS that I specifically use for developing and debugging. So an example of that is like I have one called Show Grid, which is basically, it creates a CSS gradient mix-in of a grid that overlays on top of your website so you can line things up as you're working. And it was just kind of annoying that I had to like keep commenting it out and then commenting it back in and then commenting it back out like as I needed it. And so one of the developers, I didn't know you could do this. If you change the extension to .erb, it'll still work as a Sass file, but now you can use Ruby in it. And so then he just like set it up to like only be on when we're in development mode. And so now I don't have to switch it on and off. So if you're using Ruby, maybe that's something you might want to consider. As I mentioned before, CSS preprocessors are making CSS better. A lot of the things that are in CSS preprocessing are already being discussed in CSS. So things like variables, nesting, all that stuff is going to be like real CSS that you can use. So you might as well start using it, right? Like get ahead of the game. So what else? I just wanted to drop a few resources that I like and that I find really handy. There's this book called Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS, and I was really excited when I read it because it was almost identical to the way I do things, so I feel really confident recommending it. It's this ebook by Jonathan Snook, and he gets into the detail of just like even like how to organize your selectors, how to organize your declarations, like all that stuff. So I highly recommend reading it. And the cool thing is like it's kind of like I don't know if he's stopped, but I feel like it's been like this living book. Like he's always updating it. So you always, and he'll, if you have access to the book, like he will let you know every time there's an update. There's also a small like responsive, I don't know if you would call it a framework. It's more like a boilerplate called 320 and Up. It's by Andy Clark. It started out as sort of like a companion piece to HTML5 boilerplate, and it was the whole start with a small mobile, and then work yourself upwards. Since Bootstrap came out, it's now also pulled in some of those elements, so you get some like UI elements like buttons and things like that. It was written in less, and so I ported it over to Sass, and now that's part of the repo. So if you want to use it, there's a Sass version, and I have 4 versions. It's like Sass original syntax, Sass with compass, and then there's SCSS syntax, and then SCSS with compass. So you can choose your own adventure, basically. And then I really like a lot of the work that's been done in Suzy. It's basically, it's like a layer on top of compass and on top of Sass that does all the math for you in generating grids. And it's really smart because it has like all the quick and easy mixins you can use, but it also has a lot of, like if you really want to get advanced and make your CSS like as clean as possible, it has a lot of powerful functions and things to do that. And so like all that talk I was talking about earlier about like passing in breakpoints and then, thinking about different media queries, it's actually done a lot of that work for you. So I highly recommend checking it out. And also want to mention, like if everybody's talking about Bootstrap, there is a Sass version that you can use if you want to use Bootstrap, but you want to actually use Sass. I think it's kind of bad that I see a lot of people are just using the output stuff and editing that, and I think that's bad. Like, I'd rather see people editing, the Sass or less, whichever one you pick, version of it instead. And then this one I should just recommend to. So I had this client that I was working with not too long ago who had a bunch of old legacy code, and then they added Bootstrap, the Sass version, and then they were trying to kind of create their own library. And when you start bringing in, the way I'm not talking bad about Bootstrap, okay, but the way Bootstrap was initially written, I haven't checked out the new version, but there's a lot of repetitive code in it, especially like if you're using responsive stuff. A lot of the grids get emitted again, and that's because they're using mixins instead of extend. But this actually ended up meaning a really, really long style sheet. And what we found out was happening is that Internet Explorer would just stop after a certain point. Like it would read most of the CSS, and then after a certain, I forget what the line number is or character count is, but it would just stop. And so like half of the site wasn't rendering properly. Personally, I feel like if you're at that point, you're doing something wrong. You should never be at that point. But if you are, there's this tool called Bless CSS, and what it does is dynamically splits your CSS files up. So like when I was working with this client, they manually split the files up, but then you have to like call in the same mixins and things over and over again, like because otherwise, it's not in the same file anymore. But this lets you just keep everything in the one file that you're working in, and it'll dynamically split it up for you. So it'll work with IE. So if you haven't tried it yet and you're just a little afraid, just give it a try. I promise you, you're gonna like it. I was almost kicking and screaming. I didn't want to do it, and then now I'm like evangelizing it. So I highly recommend giving it a try. I also wanted to mention that if you're scared because you're looking at the website and you think it's really ugly, and it's very text heavy. There is a task force that was recently created, and I'm helping lead that task force, and we're redesigning the Sass website to make it more awesome and friendlier and more design friendly, but also still developer friendly. So this is the new logo we just released last week. So there's a lot more that's about to come out soon. So no more weird lady on the phone. Now it's this. So yeah, lots of stuff is going to be coming out soon. You can follow Team Sass Design on Twitter if you're curious and just want to see what we're doing. You can also, this is sort of outside of the whole task force thing, but like, I like the hashtag Team Sass because you see a lot of people just like evangelizing and showing off cool things in Sass. So check out the hashtag. There's also this final quote I want to leave you with, which I really like, which is be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work. And that's by Gustav Flaubert. And I really like this quote because, especially, since I started out like in art school and I just wanted to design like crazy, weird visual stuff. But I find like the more maintainable my stuff is, the more creative expression I get to have because I don't have to focus on building it as much. I can focus on being creative. And thank you.